The American Civil War was one of the most defining conflicts in U.S. history, yet much of what people think they know about it is clouded by myths, Hollywood exaggerations, and historical oversimplifications. Were most soldiers really fighting over slavery? Did Lincoln actually want to free all enslaved people from the start? And was the South doomed to lose from the beginning? In this video, we'll break down 10 common misconceptions about the Civil War and uncover the truth behind the legends. Some of these might surprise you, and others might challenge what you were taught in school. If you love exploring the real history of the American Old West, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a deep dive into the past. Now let's set the record straight. Grant wasn't always considered a hero. In the early days of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant's military career nearly took a disastrous turn. On April 16, 1861, just days after the conflict began at Fort Sumter, Grant stepped forward to serve in the Union Army. His leadership skills quickly earned him a promotion, and he became a general working under General Henry Halleck. However, the two men had very different approaches to command, leading to frequent tensions. Halleck viewed Grant as difficult to manage and often accused him of disregarding orders. Although Grant secured crucial victories in February 1862, a breakdown in communication gave Halleck an opportunity to voice his concerns. He reported Grant's supposed lack of discipline to General George McClellan in Washington. In response, McClellan suggested firm action, writing that such behavior needed to be addressed immediately, even recommending Grant's removal if necessary. By the time McClellan's message arrived, Halleck's frustration had subsided. Instead of taking extreme action, he chose to sideline Grant rather than dismiss him outright. For a time, Grant was left out of critical decisions as Halleck assumed greater responsibilities. However, this setback was temporary. When Halleck was later transferred to Washington, Grant's leadership skills once again came to the forefront. Despite calls for his removal, President Lincoln saw Grant's potential. When pressured to dismiss him, Lincoln reportedly replied, "I can't spare this man. He fights." This turning point set the stage for Grant's rise as one of the most influential Union generals of the war. The first Civil War land battle wasn't at Manassas. The Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Many assume that the first major land battle was the First Battle of Manassas, Bull Run, in July, where spectators from Washington, D.C. arrived expecting a quick Union victory, only to retreat in chaos alongside Federal troops. Southern newspapers dubbed the event the Great Skedaddle. However, this wasn't actually the first clash on land. A lesser-known but earlier engagement took place in June 1861, when Union forces launched a surprise attack on Confederate troops in Philippi, Virginia, now part of West Virginia. Though the battle was small and resulted in no fatalities, its effects were significant. The hasty Confederate withdrawal led the Northern press to call it the Races at Philippi, a reference to the speed of the retreat. This encounter had lasting consequences. The Union's success at Philippi strengthened the push for West Virginia's separation from Virginia, a movement that would eventually lead to statehood. Additionally, the battle played a role in elevating George McClellan's reputation, helping him secure the top general position in Washington later that year. Another lasting impact came from a Confederate soldier named J.E. Hanger, an engineering student who was injured in the battle and lost a leg. Rather than let this setback define him, Hanger used his expertise to design a more advanced and flexible prosthetic limb. a groundbreaking innovation at the time. His invention laid the foundation for Hanger Prosthetics and Orthotics, a company that continues to serve amputees today. The Civil War wasn't restricted to U.S. territory. During the Civil War, Confederate privateers who operated in a legal gray area between piracy and sanctioned naval warfare posed a serious challenge to Union shipping. These private vessels, along with blockade runners, kept Union naval forces occupied in strategic waterways near Bermuda, the Bahamas, and Cuba. Meanwhile, larger Confederate commerce raiders, equipped with both steam engines and sails, roamed international waters, capturing U.S. merchant ships and negotiating the release of their crews. The Union Navy made several attempts to counter these disruptions. One notable incident occurred when the USS Wachusett engaged the CSS Florida in Bahia Harbor, Brazil, leading to diplomatic tensions between the U.S. and Brazil. In another pursuit, the USS Wyoming followed the CSS Alabama across the Far East, though it was never able to intercept the elusive raider. While in the region, the Wyoming also found itself in an unexpected skirmish with Japanese forces. In October 1864, the CSS Shenandoah focused its efforts on the busy maritime routes between the Cape of Good Hope and Australia, targeting American whaling ships in the Pacific. Even after the Civil War had officially ended, the Shenandoah continued its operations, capturing 21 more U.S. vessels, including 11 in just 7 hours near the Arctic Circle. Recognizing that the war was truly over, the Shenandoah's captain and crew made the decision to surrender. On November 6, 1865, they brought their ship into Liverpool, England, marking the formal conclusion of Confederate naval activity. Soldiers saw combat only about 1 day a month. In the 19th century, military campaigns were heavily influenced by the seasons, with unpaved roads turning to deep mud in wet weather and soldiers lacking modern all-weather clothing. Armies had to carefully time their movements. Throughout most of the Civil War, except for the final intense months of late 1864 and early 1865, military operations followed a pattern. Battles and maneuvers primarily took place during late spring, summer, and fall, while winter was a time for regrouping in winter quarters. Because of this seasonal cycle, the average Civil War soldier engaged in battle only about once every 30 days. The rest of his time was spent marching, training, or waiting in camp. However, even outside of combat, life in the camps was far from safe. Field conditions were harsh and unsanitary, and medical knowledge was still limited. As a result, soldiers faced a 1 in 4 chance of not making it through the war, even if they never saw combat. Of the more than 360,000 Union soldiers who lost their lives, fewer than 1/3 died in battle. The majority succumbed to disease, with dysentery being the most common cause. While records for Confederate forces are less complete, estimates suggest a similar pattern. Nearly 2/3 of Southern soldiers who perished did so due to illness rather than battlefield injuries. The grim reality was that, for most troops, the greatest danger came not from enemy fire, but from the harsh conditions and rampant disease of military life. Some slave owners fought for the Union. John Sixkiller was a Cherokee man who fought in the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers. He participated in the Battle of Island Mound, where he ultimately lost his life. Interestingly, despite his heritage, he was also a slave owner and brought his enslaved individuals with him into battle. This practice was not unusual in the Cherokee Nation, where African American slavery was widespread during that time. Other regions, especially the border states like Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri also contributed soldiers from slave-owning families to the Union Army. Among these states, Kentucky was particularly significant. At the start of the Civil War, nearly one-quarter of families in Kentucky owned enslaved people. Yet the state went on to supply 90 military units to fight for the Union cause. This complicated relationship with slavery influenced President Abraham Lincoln's decisions. The president, understanding the delicate balance, focused his Emancipation Proclamation solely on the Confederate states, leaving those in the border states untouched. Lincoln's reasoning was strategic. He feared that alienating states like Kentucky could lead to the defection of other border states. If that happened, the Union might have been forced to accept the South's secession, thus potentially losing the war altogether. The war was fought with basic modern weapons. Today's warfare relies heavily on technologies like electricity, rockets, and chemical weapons, though many of these technologies are now controlled or banned. Surprisingly, many of these innovations were already in use during the American Civil War, even though they seem modern by today's standards. For instance, explosive floating containers designed to sink ships had existed since the American Revolution, but the Confederates enhanced these devices by introducing electric detonators. They created what is believed to be the world's first combat electric mine station along the Mississippi River. These electric mines were connected to the shore by wires, allowing for remote detonation. Such mines were also deployed in the Eastern Theater, where one of them sank the USS Commodore Jones in Virginia's James River in May 1864. Rockets were another early form of gunpowder-propelled incendiary weapons. These had been used during the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, and both the Union and the Confederacy adopted them during the Civil War. The Union even established a 160-man rocket battalion. Additionally, incendiary devices reminiscent of Greek fire, a chemical weapon from antiquity, were used by both sides. The South also attempted biological warfare, including efforts to spread yellow fever through contaminated clothing and smallpox with some limited success. They even resorted to poisoning water supplies with animal carcasses during their retreats, though these tactics were generally ineffective. The use of these early technological advancements shows that, even during the Civil War, both sides were experimenting with strategies and weapons that would later become standard in modern combat. The North had a hard time funding the war. While it's well documented that the South faced severe financial challenges during the Civil War, the North was not without its own struggles. War is not only devastating, it's incredibly costly. At the onset of the war, the Union was ill-prepared financially. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 had already caused turmoil on Wall Street, adding to the nation's economic instability. Compounding the issue, in the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson dismantled the centralized banking system, arguing that it was a threat to state rights and individual liberties. As a result, the U.S. government had no established system to efficiently fund a war effort. Adding to the chaos, there were over 10,000 different types of paper currency in circulation, further complicating financial matters. With the assistance of Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase, Lincoln eventually managed to establish a more organized financial framework to sustain the war effort. However, the financial difficulties remained, and Union troops, especially African American soldiers, often went without pay for extended periods. As part of the effort to raise funds, Congress passed the first federal income tax in 1862. In response, the Confederacy also introduced its own form of income tax in 1863, as both sides struggled to meet the enormous costs of war. Presidents Lincoln and Davis didn't always lead from the rear. Today, we often think of the presidents of the Union and Confederacy as symbols of power, akin to prominent pieces in a game of chess. However, both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were actively involved in the physical aspects of the Civil War, showing up in critical moments during actual battles. In 1862, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, observed the Battle of Seven Pines, also known as Fair Oaks. This battle, which proved indecisive and bloody, was a significant moment in the war, and afterward, Davis appointed Robert E. Lee to command the Confederate Army. As they made their way back to Richmond, these two men were not removed from the day-to-day struggles of the war, but instead played an active role in directing the Confederate military's strategy. Similarly, Abraham Lincoln wasn't a passive leader either. In 1864, he visited Fort Stevens, located outside of Washington, D.C., during an engagement with Confederate forces. Lincoln's presence on the front lines was so significant that Confederate General Jubal Early later remarked, "We didn't take Washington, but we scared Abe Lincoln like hell." While this claim may have been exaggerated for effect, it demonstrated the close proximity between the president and the dangers of the battlefield, as well as Lincoln's direct involvement in overseeing the defense of the Capitol. Lincoln's physical presence continued in 1865 during the Siege of Richmond. In March of that year, he visited General Ulysses S. Grant's headquarters, staying aboard a ship just outside the front lines. He could hear the sounds of gunfire as the siege intensified, underscoring the critical nature of the military actions. Once Richmond fell, Lincoln took a bold step by entering the Confederate capital, now deserted by Jefferson Davis and his cabinet. Lincoln's final act in Richmond was symbolic. He sat in the chair once occupied by Davis, sending a powerful message about the Union's victory and the Confederacy's defeat. Through these events, Lincoln proved that his leadership was not just confined to the political sphere. He was willing to face the war's dangers directly and, in doing so, emphasized his resolve in a way that was deeply personal and impactful. Honest Abe knew how to make a statement, not just through words, but through his actions on the ground, cementing his place in history as a leader who truly understood the gravity of the war he was overseeing. The war didn't end at Appomattox. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee formally surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, marking a pivotal moment in the end of the Civil War. However, this significant surrender did not immediately end the conflict. While Lee's surrender effectively marked the collapse of the Confederate stronghold in the East, fighting continued in other regions of the South. Just over 2 weeks later, on April 26, General Joseph Johnston, commander of the Army of Tennessee, the Confederacy's second-largest and most important remaining fighting force, surrendered to General William Tecumseh Sherman at Durham Station, North Carolina. Despite this, many Confederate soldiers remained in the field, continuing to resist Union forces. The Confederate surrender continued in the following weeks. On May 4th, General Richard Taylor surrendered his force of 12,000 men in the Confederate Department of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana, signaling a continued decline in Confederate military strength. However, the war was far from over. In fact, on May 12th to 13th, over a month after the historic surrender at Appomattox, the last battle of the Civil War occurred at Palmito Ranch in Texas, where Union and Confederate forces clashed in a relatively minor confrontation. Following this final battle, Confederate General Kirby Smith, who commanded the Trans-Mississippi Department, initially hoped to continue fighting. However, recognizing the futility of prolonged resistance, General Simon B. Buckner surrendered on May 26 on behalf of Smith, bringing an end to significant Confederate military activity in the West. Finally, on June 23rd, the last Confederate general to surrender, Stand Watie, did so in Indian Territory, submitting to Colonel Asa C. Matthews of the Union Army. This marked the official end of Confederate resistance in the United States. However, the Civil War was not fully over at this point, as Confederate naval efforts continued. It wasn't until November 1865 that the last Confederate commerce raider, operating in the seas, officially surrendered, completing the Confederacy's collapse in all arenas. This protracted end to the war illustrates the complexity of the Confederate surrender. Despite key surrenders like Lee's at Appomattox, pockets of resistance persisted across the southern states, and Confederate military leaders in various departments held out in the hopes of continuing the fight. While land battles largely ceased in the spring of 1865, Confederate naval forces and isolated pockets of resistance ensured that the war would not truly end until every last Confederate soldier and general laid down their arms. African American Glory tells the story of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which holds a significant place in U.S. history as the first African American military unit raised in the northern states. The regiment was formed in 1863, coinciding with the time of the Battle of Fort Wagner, one of the most famous battles involving African American soldiers. However, the establishment of African American military forces in the Union Army started earlier, in 1862, well before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, or the Louisiana Native Guard made their historic charge at Port Hudson in 1863. In October 1862, the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers, a unit of African American soldiers, made a notable contribution to the Union war effort. They successfully repelled Confederate cavalry forces at Island Mound in Missouri. At that time, the U.S. Army had not yet officially enlisted African American soldiers, but local Union officials in Kansas took the initiative to organize a regiment. The 1st Kansas was formed in August 1862, even though African American troops were not officially recognized by the federal government. By late October, a unit of approximately 240 men from the 1st Kansas was dispatched to Bates County, Missouri, with the mission of neutralizing a group of Confederate guerrillas. In a strategic move, the 1st Kansas took control of a local farm and established a defensive position, which they named Fort Africa. Despite being outnumbered, they managed to hold their ground for 2 days, and upon receiving reinforcements, the Confederate forces eventually withdrew. Though the Island Mound engagement was relatively small and did not have a significant military impact, it drew national attention and marked an important step in the acceptance of African American soldiers in the Union Army. The courage and resilience displayed by the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers in this battle helped set the stage for the formation of more African American units, such as the 54th Massachusetts. Their bravery helped challenge prevailing racial prejudices and demonstrated that African American soldiers were capable of standing up to the Confederate forces, contributing meaningfully to the Union war effort. The actions at Island Mound were more than just a military skirmish. They were a symbol of the emerging role that African Americans would play in the Civil War. This battle provided proof that African American soldiers were not only willing to fight, but were also effective in combat. The story of the first Kansas colored volunteers serves as a precursor to the more widely known contributions of African American soldiers, such as those of the 54th Massachusetts, highlighting their essential role in the Union's eventual victory. The Civil War is one of the most studied conflicts in American history, yet myths and misconceptions continue to shape our understanding of it. From the real reasons behind the war to the truth about daily life on the battlefield, separating fact from fiction helps us see this pivotal era more clearly. History is never as simple as the legends make it seem, and the Old West was deeply connected to the Civil War in ways that might surprise you. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on more fascinating stories from the American Old West. Got a Civil War myth you've heard before? Drop it in the comments below.